Hey everyone, welcome to Source, the ReThink Mining Podcast. We're going to explore mining, its innovation, and transformation in the industry that's going to drive our world forward. I'm Carl, I'm your host, and the Executive Director and CEO of ReThink Mining. What we're going to do with this podcast is meet some really interesting people, talk about the industry, talk about innovations, talk about new technology, and explore what's actually possible and what we can do collectively to create the minerals and metals that are necessary to drive our world forward. I hope you join us. Today we've got a really cool guest on Source, Mike Milinkovich. He's the Executive Director and CEO of the Eclipse Foundation. And some of you are probably wondering, I wonder what the connectivity is between open source software and mining. Well, we were very fortunate to have Mike talk at one of our innovation events. People were really excited by that. And the journey that Mike has gone with Eclipse and in various industries, we believe are directly relevant to mining. So we're really looking forward to this conversation. So Mike, welcome to this podcast.
Thank you, Carl. It's great to be here.
Yeah, and to get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and about Eclipse, the Eclipse Foundation? What is it?
Yeah, so lots of things to pull together here. So first thing, since we're doing a mining podcast, I should mention that I'm originally from Northern Ontario, and I've got one branch of my family is from the Timmins gold mining region. And my grandfather was an Inco nickel miner from Sudbury, and I was actually born in Sudbury General Hospital.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
So my roots in mining go way back, but I've been a software guy pretty much my entire career. Yeah. So I grew up in a telecoms world. Went to Carleton University. My first degree was in business, and then I realized, and I worked in finance in Bell Northern Research, and realized that I would rather build things than count things.
That's a good way of putting it.
So I went back to school. When I did my undergrad, I'd filled up all my electives in computer science, and I went back to Carleton and got a master's in information and system sciences, and basically became a computer guy. I went back to Bell Northern Research as a software developer. And then I did. I bounced back and forth between startups and big companies. Did okay in the startup world. Sold one company to IBM. Sold another company to Oracle. And
that sounds like it's more than okay, Mike.
Well, sorry, I was not the CEO. I was just one of the executives in these companies. So and then 20 years ago, I became the executive director of the Eclipse Foundation. And the background on that is kind of interesting. So I basically, at that time I was a VP at Oracle, and when IBM spun the Eclipse Foundation out of the Eclipse project, which is now 20 years, it's like just a little bit over 20 years ago, they were really looking for somebody that kind of knew the business, knew the industry, knew the people. And that was involved in the project and knew but somebody who wasn't from IBM. That was actually one of the key criteria.
But you were at IBM before that.
I went into IBM through an acquisition, but I'd been out of IBM for 4 or 5 years at that point.
Okay, so you're familiar but not embedded.
Yeah, exactly. So let's talk a little bit about what open source is, what Eclipse Foundation is, and why this might have something to do with mining.
And the open source question, I think there's a lot of misconceptions about open source. Yeah. And when we first met many years ago when I was working at Carleton, actually, I had misconceptions about it, and through yourself and other people actually corrected some of that, open source software, hardware, et cetera. So understanding that a bit more, because what we're hearing is it's not relevant. There's backdoors, it's insecure, we can't use it. Usual stuff is what we're hearing. So please educate us.
Well, yeah. So this is like a flashback to 20 years ago. Before we get to open source, let's talk about the importance of software.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So we've all heard this phrase, software is eating the world. Yeah. Well, I would actually say at this point, I think it's more like software ate the world.
Yep, absolutely.
Pretty much any industry you talk about, software is now becoming the number one way that you deliver value to your customers. Yep. Right? It used to be that if you're in the automotive business, you wanted to be a mechanical engineer. Eventually, you wanted to be an electrical or electronics engineer, but now you want to be a software engineer. Yep. And that's no matter what industry. And I'm not a specialist in mining, but I am willing to predict that the same thing is happening in mining as it is in every other industry on the planet. Maybe they're a little bit behind, but we'll get there.
Initial stages probably, but
Yeah.
even on the companies moving forward in software, I remember, and correct me if I'm wrong, just the example I know is Cisco.
Sure.
When John Chambers came in, they came in as a switch company. And
Yeah.
he basically, he was an evangelist, said, we're going to turn it into a software company.
Sure. But even if you go back before that, when I was working at
Yeah.
Bell Northern Research, the DMS 100 was the mainstay product.
Yeah.
Like was like the digital switch. Well, it was implemented primarily in software.
Yeah.
There was a lot of specialized hardware in there, but it was a lot about software. The key point is that no matter what industry you're in, software is becoming a key part of how you drive. And it might not be true of mining yet, per se, but I bet you that when you look at if you're running a mine, if you're operating a mine, if you look at the new equipment that's coming your way, whether it's a dump or whatever kind of machinery you're talking about, more and more of that machine is being the features of that machine are being driven by software.
Yep.
And so even if software hasn't sort of hit the mine operators yet as a disruptive force, I'm sure that it is changing the way the supply chain the equipment and the operating software of the companies is going.
And sorry, Mike, it actually is starting, like in software in general, digital versus software, but it is software.
Yeah.
It's actually starting to make big impacts in the industry. I think it's a next step.
Right. So
It's
we keep hearing this phrase digitalization or digital transformation.
Absolutely.
And what does that really mean? Well, I have a definition.
I'm glad you do.
What digital transformation really means is you take a company that is in a traditional industry and you reform the culture of that company and the operations of that company to be a software-centric organization. So think about it this way. I'll just finish saying, when it comes to software, the value that you're delivering to your customers no matter what industry, and the value you're delivering to your customers is largely being driven by software. Well, when you think about it, the companies that are ultimately going to succeed in the longer term in those industries are the ones that make the transformation to really embracing the fact that software is now central to their business.
Yep, absolutely.
And there are a lot of different changes that have to occur for that to happen.
Yep.
And one of the worst things you can do is let's go hire 100 software engineers and that'll make us software centric. Because if you still put them under the traditional, management structures and just try to form a team from whole cloth, that is almost a guaranteed failure pattern.
We've seen it happen.
Yeah, it's I don't think I've ever seen it work. So
exactly.
it's just not the way things work in the real life. So software is center of the business. Digital transformation is becoming software centric. Now we can start talking about open source.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so one of the things to understand about software is that I don't care what product you're talking about, whether you're talking about your iPhone or you're talking about an Android phone or your television, like your banking system, whatever bank in Canada you're working with, is like, it doesn't matter what software you are touching in your daily life. 80% of that software is actually open source. Yeah. Nobody builds software from scratch anymore. You would be, and if you do, you're probably going out of business because you'll get smoked by the companies that are building software by primarily assembling pre-built components available under open source licenses, free for you to use and redistribute. And then basically what that allows you to do is it allows you to take your software engineering team and they have to focus maniacally on what are the features that we need to add that actually your customers care about. Software is so complex and there's so much of it that if you try to build everything from scratch, you won't get it done. And it'll be poorer quality than your competitors that are assembling these pre-built components.
Errors in millions of lines of code.
There are errors, but the other thing too is it distracts your focus from actually building the features your customers care about.
Exactly.
Right? So what open source allows you to do is accelerate your product development and mitigate your risk of failure. Anything that you can think about it's almost like a free lunch, right? Yeah. Any business-oriented activity where you can get faster time to market and lower risk, like why aren't you, and it's free.
Yeah.
Like Like, why aren't you doing this?
And the other part of this too is basically changes to the software. It's done by an open source community. Like, it's being updated by other people. You don't need a team of people to make sure that you're updating this stuff constantly. Some of the back end components are already done.
Yeah. Although, plant that, maybe we should come back.
Yeah.
There is a bit of a myth.
Yeah.
That this thing called the community exists.
Yeah.
And
surprise on my end.
And well, so it does exist, but there's some very deep misconceptions about that. So actually, one of the misconceptions that I corrected with you, I think one of the first time we met, like probably 12 years ago, was that open source is primarily developed by amateurs living, hippies living in their mom's garage. Yeah. Right? There's that misconception that when we talk about the open source community, we're talking about an unprofessional rabble of crowdsourced source code that nobody would want to ever use in a real product.
And I think people still believe that today.
Yes.
Outside of who are not familiar with open source.
There is. That's a very. Yes. It is a very common. But most people don't understand how much of their lives are actually being driven by software.
Yeah.
Right. When you buy a new car and the guy says, "Oh, this is 20 more kilometers per a liter of gas than the previous model," you go, "Oh, it must have done a better job of shaping the cylinders." No, it's software, right? It's like it's like, "Oh, it's got Apple CarPlay." That's software. It's like all these features that customers care about are largely driven by software.
Yeah.
And so when we get to the point where, back to the open source question. All right, so
the community.
The community is most of the. Yes, there are people who develop open source code just because they love writing code.
Yeah,
these people do exist.
Yeah,
but most of the core applications and core building blocks of open source software are being built by professionals. Many times working for large companies, whether it's Google or IBM, Facebook, Oracle, Red Hat. I mean, multi-billion-dollar companies. And more, by the way, and we can segue to this at some point, and more are being developed by companies like Bosch and Mercedes and Volkswagen. And, this approach to developing software is becoming more and more prevalent. So it's not so, but one of the misconceptions about the community, one big misconception is and I've heard this more times than I want to think, is well, we'll make it open source and the community will show up and help us work on it. That is categorically not true. Yeah. The only reason why somebody is going to come and work on your code is if they find value in it and they're using it.
And there was an example of mining where that actually happened. It turned out to be one or two people and nobody came to the table and it's gone.
Yeah. Well, yeah. It turns out, by the way, it is, as somebody who's been doing this now for 20 years, it is shockingly hard to give stuff away for free.
Yeah. Okay. We're going down a lot of tangents.
Yeah,
here, we'd be here for days.
Yeah, maybe we come back to that one. But this idea so there is a community. It's much more professional than most people think it is. It's much more backed by corporations than people think it is. And they're not going to come and help you. Right. So one of the things to keep in mind, as I mentioned earlier, that open source is free, and it is. It doesn't charge you anything to download it and run it, use it, distribute it, modify it. All of those freedoms are essential to open source. But think of it as free as in puppy.
Got it. Fully got it.
So, if you get a new puppy, I mean, you're like, oh, thanks for the free puppy.
It's not free.
It's now you got to feed it. Now you got to clean it. You got to clip its toenails. You got to do all this stuff, right? And that's one of the other misconceptions is that this software is for free. And what you have to think about, and this is becoming related to cybersecurity and all kinds of stuff, but more and more, there's going to be pressure on the companies that are using open source software to figure out ways to give back to the upstream projects that they're using. And it kind of makes sense from a business point of view. If you think about the fact that if you take a business dependency on something, and it's now become core to your product, and you have no influence, no knowledge, no way to have an impact on the next feature set, or when bugs get fixed, when security patches happen, if you have zero mechanism by which you can do that for the upstream project, then you're putting your business at risk.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So there is a bit of a to and fro that needs to happen. Right now, there is far more just thank you for the free stuff and no return contribution.
Yeah.
But I think for lots of different reasons, that equation is going to start to change over time, and there's going to be more contribution back.
Yeah.
So, sort of try to connect the dots here to the mining industry,
Eclipse too.
Yeah. Well, so Eclipse Foundation, who are we? So we've been around now for 20 years.
Yeah.
We originally started with effectively one project, and that was an IDE, an integrated development environment that IBM built called the Eclipse Project. And it had an enormous market share in amongst Java developers. It was also very popular with C and C++ developers, PHP developers. There was a version of Eclipse for almost every programming language. And that the original project was released in 2001. And IBM spun it out into a separate nonprofit foundation in 2004. Okay, so why did IBM open source something? This is a very novel idea in 2001, and why did they put it into a foundation? So they open sourced it because they wanted to build a tooling platform for Java that the entire industry could adopt.
Cool.
So in the IT industry at that time, Microsoft was taking off like a rocket. This was around the time of Windows 2000 shipped, shortly after NT Server. And Microsoft was getting a larger and larger footprint into IBM's core business in the enterprise. And IBM basically took a two-prong approach to blunt Microsoft's momentum in the marketplace. That was Linux and Java.
Yep.
And in the Java case, they were competing with Microsoft's Visual Studio and C# and BASIC and those technologies coming from Microsoft with Java. There wasn't an IDE, development environment for Java developers that was as good as Visual Studio.
Yeah.
But they wanted not just to be an IBM product; they wanted the whole industry to adopt it. So that's why they open sourced it. Why did they put it into an independent foundation? Well, what they realized after a few years is that IBM's friends were happy to use free stuff and happy to adopt it and put it in their products. But IBM's direct competitors in the Java industry, the ones that they really needed to adopt this, would not do it because it was controlled by IBM. So it had to go into an arm's length nonprofit, and that's kind of when the Eclipse Foundation started. Yeah. And when I went in. Now, so I'm not going to go through 20 entire years of history, but we've transitioned from one project to the point now where we have 420 projects. Wow. And we transitioned from like 20 or 30 paying members to 280 paying members, 350 in total.
So the uptake of businesses interested in open source and contributing for providing value to the companies has just gone through the roof.
Yeah, and we've really branched out. With all these projects, if our original franchise, if you will, was development tools, I would say now that's one of 4 major franchises that we have. The other 3 being cloud native Java. We have a whole bunch of projects and specifications that basically define and implement enterprise Java. Yep. So that's one. The next one is IoT and Edge. Yep. So Internet of Things, and there's a lot of technologies that we have in there that actually have been picked up and used in various mining applications and mining technologies, and things like protocols like MQTT. CoAP, lightweight M2M, there's all these different technologies are available in free open source packages from the Eclipse Foundation. And the fourth one is software-defined vehicle.
Okay, cool. They all sound very interesting.
Yeah, and then I guess so we've really branched out, grown tremendously in terms of membership, projects, technologies. So it's been a really interesting ride over the last 20 years. And one of the things that we did is, originally we were a U.S.-based nonprofit.
Yeah, Delaware, right? Was it
Delaware? Really, originally Delaware Incorporated. We actually ran it from Ottawa and that's where I live. But that was also where the original IBM development team that built Eclipse was from. So that was sort of the geographic connection.
And a lot of them were Carleton University grads. I remember.
Absolutely, yeah, very.
As am I.
Yeah, and actually, it was small aside, but I wish Carleton University would have done more to reflect the fact that Those guys, all of them except one, were Carleton University graduates. Won the one of the most prestigious awards you can in computer science, which is the ACM Systems Award.
Oh, okay.
And we never managed to get Carleton University to actually recognize the fact.
Never heard about it. I did know when I was there and pushed internally quite a bit. We're segueing a little bit that the highest number of distinguished engineers, I think is the term in IBM, in any development in any CAS, Center for Advanced Studies, were Carleton grads.
Yep, for sure.
Compared to any university in the world, it's Carleton grads, and people were shocked when they heard that.
Yeah.
So
that all goes back to the stuff that they were doing in the early '80s at Carleton around object-oriented programming.
absolute oops. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Eclipse.
So we
Delaware.
moved. So we were Delaware. Starting, it was like 6 years ago. We had a board meeting. Actually, it was 5 years ago. It was fall of 2019. One of our board members said, Eclipse Foundation is doing really, really well in Europe. You should analyze what you're doing well here and figure out a way to whether you can do even more. And it was like one of those, the whole parable about boiling a frog slowly in water.
Yeah.
Well, we had become European without actually realizing it. When we actually ran the numbers, 2/3 of our paying members and 2/3 of our projects were European. And the other thing is that there was a whole bunch of stuff that was coming out of the European Union that was open source this, open source that. It was becoming more and more strategic to all the research and innovation agenda in Europe. And so we talked about some ideas of what we could do, and then we actually decided, well, why don't we just become European? And so we've reorganized ourselves, and we're now a legally headquartered in Brussels as a international nonprofit association based in Brussels. And we have over doubled in size. We've grown 130% since we made that transition effective in January 2020.
Wow.
2021. So it's been nuts. And I mean, software-defined vehicle, that's why it came our direction. In Europe, there's this whole notion, you hear this phrase, digital sovereignty.
Yes.
And basically, every single initiative that's related to digital sovereignty in Europe, if you actually look, dig deep into it and find out where is the actual code, the software that's going to implement these various aspects of digital sovereignty, all of them are open source projects at the Eclipse Foundation.
Really?
Yeah. Like Gaia X, Katina X, data spaces, digital twins, Industry 4.0, all of them have projects
Eclipse Foundation.
At the Eclipse Foundation.
Yeah.
Wow. So it's, and on top of that, we're also very active in the Horizon Europe research programs.
Yeah.
And I think we're involved in something over 20 different Horizon Europe projects.
In the Horizon projects.
Yeah.
Wow.
So it's, so our move to Europe has been a real big win for us. Yeah. I think in 2022, we hired 18 people. Almost all in Europe,
for a nonprofit and open source. It sounds like a business.
Absolutely, it is. So this year we started this year. It's over 70 people, and we'll be between 80 and 85 by the end of this year for sure.
So you've got a just really quickly in the company structure. You're still incorporated in Delaware. You're incorporated in Brussels.
We have another nonprofit in Canada because we have 35 people in Canada, and we have a for-profit GmbH in Germany.
Yeah, and you're doing all four.
Well, So we have boards and we have
an executive head of each one.
Yeah, I'm the. Yes, a little bit different in Germany because there's 3 managing directors. But yes,
same idea.
Yeah, same idea. Yeah, so
you're a busy guy.
Well, yeah, and it's kind of like the random stuff I know about nonprofit law in Belgium is just I never said that was not one of my lifetime aspirations.
But something curious about this again, the internationalization, for lack of a better term. So you just said, Mike, that there's 35 members in Canada. And
employees.
Employees.
Yeah,
Okay. In terms of membership around the world from companies that are contributing, is there a big differentiation, or is there?
So first of all, I'm not sure we have any members in Canada. We have a good bunch of the tech companies you would expect in the US, IBM, Oracle,
usual ones,
Google, Amazon, all the usual ones that you would expect. A lot of European companies, including a lot of the like traditional industry. So I mentioned Bosch and Mercedes; they're both strategic members on our board. But
and that shows a shift from a car manufacturer to how important software digitalization is to Mercedes, for example.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Actually, it's really interesting. Almost all these companies now, if you type in Mercedes-Benz open source manifesto, and Bosch open source manifesto, you can search on these things and they exist.
I'd like to see the same. And one of the reasons for this podcast as well is I'd love to see as the mining industry moves into the digital transformation, we see the same thing with the OEMs in the mining industry.
Sure.
Right. That to me that's a no-brainer. It's got to happen. So just back to a really quick question on the number of members per. Are you seeing? And this may be more of a political question. You don't have to answer if you don't want to. But the fact that there's zero or very few members in Canada, is that because there's not enough companies in Canada, or is it because there's not enough interest in open source, or you're not quite sure? I'm just curious about that, having been in the innovation system in Canada for like 40 years.
Actually, I just don't know.
Yeah, I didn't know if it was a.
I mean, obviously, there's big companies in Canada, and like like here we are in Toronto. I'm like every bank that's here uses tons of software from the Eclipse Foundation.
Yeah, it
just never occurred to them that they might want to join.
Okay, so they use it, but they're not members. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So
free advertisement, banks.
But in fairness, most of our members are companies that are adopting our technology and using it in products.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? As opposed to enterprises that are using our projects in internal applications and the like.
It's a delineation of membership versus use.
Yeah. Now, there are other open source foundations, Cloud Native Computing Foundation, for example, that has actually done a great job of recruiting membership from enterprises. We've just, for whatever reason, we've just never done a particularly good job of that.
Okay.
There's lots of motivations why they could and should, but they just haven't.
Okay, cool. So on the like Eclipse, not-for-profit, or multiple not-for-profits and for-profit, and basically you're creating software protocols and platforms. You got 4 areas. Just a really quick question on the whole idea of co-development. Like this is we use the term co-development, right? Because you've got a bunch of people co-developing a platform piece of software. That's basically what's happening.
Yeah.
Right.
So
and the companies do that, and the people in the companies do that because. Not just because they're interested, they're gearheads and they love coding, of course, but also because this is going to be relevant to us.
Sure. Great question. I probably should have put a caveat at the front that when I talk about people who work at the Eclipse Foundation, we don't have any software developers.
Yeah. No, I would talk. Yeah.
So often people misunderstand that. So when I talk about the staff, they're doing things like marketing support, program managers.
Evangelist, I think was one of the titles.
Yeah, well, now I think we don't use evangelist, developer advocates.
Okay, yeah, I remember that title.
Somebody decided that was more politically correct or something. So the software developers come from companies that are primarily that want to work on.
Absolutely.
And that's where the co-develop thing comes in. Yeah. And so what does that mean? So when you think about what is it that we actually do at the Eclipse Foundation, what we do is provide a vendor-neutral governance platform so that some of the biggest companies, including direct competitors, can come together and work on software together in an antitrust protected way. So that's one of the things that's one of the problems that open source solves. Like if you want to, typically or historically, if you had 3 companies that wanted to work on a piece of technology together, they had to create a joint venture, and you could get tied up in
10 years of legal stuff.
Yeah, easily. Yeah. Or in some cases, or you don't do code, you just do specifications, and you create an association and you build some specifications, and you have a big antitrust policy and. It's really complicated to get yourself into a situation where multiple companies can work on something together. And basically, how open source fixes this problem or makes this problem a much easier to deal with is that when you work in open source, you co-develop a piece of software and you're working towards your mutual requirements to solve your mutual problem. But the fruits of that labor is available to everybody on the planet for free, royalty free. And that's really what gives you an enormous amount of antitrust protection, because it's not typically what you do in a joint venture is then you have an IP sharing arrangement and the down the road, the economic benefits that come for, the value capture that arises from that software development is eventually owned, comes back to the partners, and it's a walled garden. Yeah. And when you do that, then there's concerns about market dominance, especially when you have, direct competitors working together. There's concerns about market dominance from all of the market regulators, no matter what country you're talking about. Exactly. Right. Open source fixes all that because the fruits of the labor is available to everybody on the planet for free. Right. And free's a great price.
Well, exactly, but it's not always free. But the one thing you did say, and we just had a discussion today about this in the last couple of days, is and I've mentioned this to you a couple of times, is one, the Eclipse Foundation, we borrowed your membership model. Like, we lifted it directly. It's open source and free, right? Mm-hmm. It changed it a little bit. But the other thing too, you just said a governance platform where competitors, that's exactly what we do. The whole idea of us doing co-development, that terminology, we've borrowed that from your practice. Yeah. And that term that you just said, we just said it like 2 hours ago with somebody else doing similar thing, but in a mining industry developing not nasty stuff, but pretty intensive hardware challenge. Same idea. Yeah. Neutral space, governance platform. You solve all the IP stuff. Ours is a little different. There's a pseudo walled garden, but the concept is virtually identical to what you're doing. Yeah. Yeah. So awesome. You just validated what I've spent 11 years on.
Great.
Anyway, so on that, in the co-developed software solutions, you have all these different projects, and et cetera. The sort of projects you have, like, I'm curious about the other, what do you call them, traditional industries? Yeah. Like you've worked in, I think one of the examples you used at our event several years ago was aerospace. You've also used automotive. I'm kind of curious about not how they do and why they do, but we're a car manufacturer to we're now software manifesto published at our web. How did that transition? How did that happen?
And first of all, so it's a journey. So it's a process, not an event.
Yes, I know that.
and I wouldn't say that any of them have finished the journey, but they're on the journey. Yeah. And so let's think about the challenges that face the automotive industry right now. And by the way, when we talk about the automotive industry, you have to think about multiple different segments or technology. Yeah. So there's a lot of times people, when they talk about automotive, they focus on the software that runs in the car. Yeah. Right. And that's definitely part of it. But when you, in the broader sense of the automotive industry, there's also the manufacturing. Absolutely. Which is a huge, and very IP intensive industry in its own right. How do we actually build these cars and, lean and agile manufacturing methods and all the machinery that goes into that. So that's and then there are also enormous consumers and producers of IT itself. Yes. Like the IT arms of these companies are huge. Everything from dealer networks to supply chain management. There's three different things that when you talk about the automotive industry is, there's in-car and now there's connected car. That's, related to it because there's, and that sort of links back into the IT part, but there's in-car, there's manufacturing, there's IT. Yep. And then you think about the challenges that are facing the automotive industry. Well, one is electrification. Yep. And there's all kinds of stuff that goes in with that. Amongst, not least among them, is an electric car has 1/10 of the number of parts in it than an internal combustion engine car. Yeah. So simpler to manufacture, simpler to build,
potentially simpler supply chain.
Potentially, except for that whole lithium cycle thing. Which I hope Canada figures out. And
that's a whole other conversation.
Let's talk about Ring of Fire for a while.
Yeah, we'll be here for 100 years.
Yes, so will the Ring of Fire.
It'd be easier to talk about new battery chemistries than that.
Yeah, exactly. Another challenge that they have is autonomous.
Yes.
So the increase of and by the way, that's an interesting market thing in and of itself, because like a bunch of people in Silicon Valley got convinced that they were going to figure out how to do autonomous driving way faster than the car manufacturers, but so they seeded the market with lots of marketing money that said that everybody should expect autonomous driving in their cars, and the future is actually a little bit more complicated than that. A little
different,
and then the other thing that's changing, that's really affecting, is this is sort of ties into what we call software-defined vehicle, is the architecture, the systems architecture of what is in an automobile is changing. And I'm sure very similar things are happening in mining equipment as well. So if you think about an automobile today, if you buy any kind of reasonably high-end car, think of it as a network of 120 little computers on a CAN bus, probably 3 or 4 different buses, all talking amongst themselves, but it's a distributed computing platform on wheels.
I've never heard of that. Distributed computing platform on wheels. That's cool. I've never heard of that.
Yeah, I mean, so just think like, you hit the brakes really hard and your anti-lock brakes go, and a little icon shows up on your dashboard telling that you're like, how'd that happen? Right? I mean, like, because there's 4 different braking systems and they're all going to send a signal on a bus, and there's going to be, and then there's actually an expectation that within a certain number of milliseconds, that alert is going to come up on the dashboard, right? So, but that's the architecture today. The architecture of the future is, instead of thinking of it as a distributed computing platform on wheels, it's going to be a server on wheels.
Okay.
Right. And more of the functionality is going to be centralized into a pretty robust server class computer that's handling more and more of the functionality of the car in a single computer.
I had assumed that was the case, but it's not.
No, not to. I mean, so right now, what happens is, yes, you have a computer in your dashboard. It has Android
and on
Auto,
the exhaust, and onto this, and onto that.
But the computer that's in your dashboard is largely separate from anything that's related to the functional safety operations of the vehicle. Right? It's a consumer electronic device. The idea is down the road is that you're going to have a much bigger, more robust computer that's going to have using hypervisor technology, is going to allocate certain CPUs to the safe operation of the car, a certain number of CPUs to the autonomous driving, and a certain number of CPUs to the in-cabin experience. Right, and that's a really, really different architecture, and that's part of why you hear this phrase software defined. So if you think about...
Well, it's like SDR, software defined radio 20 years ago, same idea.
But software defined in a certain... What does that actually mean? So there's this meta trend that's been happening across technology in many and many different segments, where over the last 20 years, where you take something that used to be defined by very specific hardware and very specific software, and you turn it into something that is commodity hardware, perhaps with an extra peripheral or two, and it's running an open source operating system, usually Linux. Right. Software defined networking, software defined storage, software defined radio. Right. I mean, one of the, like, when you think back to the radio towers that were going up GPRS, 2G, 3G. Right, those were very, very specialized devices with radio frequency controlled antennas in them, yada yada yada. Now 5G, it's basically a general purpose computer with a software defined radio and a Linux operating system.
And 6G is going to be what?
Yeah, exactly. It's only going to go more that direction. So it's it's software defined. Think of it as commodity hardware, or general purpose computers,
off the shelf,
right? And then, but in the complex world of this software defined vehicle, in addition to all the complexity of changing this architecture, at the same time, they have to deal with increased consumer expectations around connected car scenarios, like having the ability to do over-the-air updates, for example. Which basically turns your car, that basically brings Moore's Law to your car. So right now, when you buy a car, the expected life of a car is 15 years. And by the way, if you haven't tried, Try getting insurance on a car that's older than 15 years
Yeah.
now, right?
Yeah.
As soon as you hit some limit, the insurance company starts racking it up because it's hard to get parts and all that. Remember, like, people lovingly have like 1967 Firebirds in the garage,
It's
but
now an antique.
Yeah, but
it's a different class of car.
Yeah,
for insurance.
So there's going to be this general trend where software-defined vehicles is going to be more and more about fairly commodity hardware, hypervisor. There's going to probably be a real-time operating system in there and a general-purpose Linux operating system running on different hypervisors. It's a really, really, really different architecture. Then you have the whole connected car with over-the-air downloads, app stores now, being able to bring sort of immersive experiences into the driver's cockpit, and the ability to have entertainment experiences on your dashboard when you're parked, and all those sorts of things.
So this stack, this open source software stack that Eclipse is working on, or that you have one or two or three or multiple projects on related to software-defined vehicles, that's being developed to meet this future trend of the vehicles, and autonomy is another part of that,
right?
Potentially.
And here's why. Okay, so right now in the first mover advantage in this space is Tesla. Right?
Yeah.
They basically put this enormous screen in and they're ahead on the software mostly because they
it's open source.
Well, they don't open source their stuff, but they sure use a lot of open source in their stack.
Everything internal.
Yeah. So there's 37 OEMs in the world, apparently. It was the number I heard. Well, so and 36 other than Tesla. If everyone tries to build their own software-defined vehicle stack, first of all, remember what I said before about the benefits of open source being faster time to market, risk mitigation. There's a third one, which is shared costs.
Yes, of course.
Right. So basically, what you're seeing here is, and so the companies that are involved in the Eclipse software-defined vehicle include, on the OEM level, we've got Cariad, which is Volkswagen. We've got Mercedes-Benz. We've got GM. Then we've got Bosch, ZF, Continental, Electrobit. On and on and on and on and on. So there's 35 different automotive companies that are involved in this, and the vision is build co-develop software platforms that they can then use on a shared cost, shared risk basis in their future generation of automobiles.
And what you just said is the same sort of approach we take. You're de-risking the cost, but you're also de-risking and accelerating technology development.
Yeah.
Right. That's why you're doing the co-development piece, right?
Yeah.
It's really simple. And you get you get a better product because you get a lot of really smart people from various industries, various companies that are looking at this and bringing more value than if you had your own team building it themselves internally.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And in addition to the car manufacturers, we also have a really good cross-section of the IT industry involved.
Yeah. Well, there's a direct relationship between the two of them.
Yeah. Well, with connected car scenario, I mean, the cloud vendor, so Microsoft is in there, AWS is in there, IBM and Red Hat are in there. And a lot of that motivation is down the road, particularly the big cloud hyperscalers, they want to attract the workloads of doing over-the-air updates and providing and picking up the telemetry data from the cars.
So they see the vision of where this is going and strategically are involved because they want to help get there so they can actually
make money.
The value.
Yeah.
Acquire the value.
And actually, we haven't really talked about this, but like one of the things people so I've been talking about the fact that we give open source away for free.
Yeah.
I don't want people to go away with the idea that there's not money to be made in this.
Well, it's funny. That's what happened. That was the question at the forum we had where you went and spoke. Half the audience went, "This is really cool. Mining has to do this." The other half, one person actually asked you that. I'll never forget this. He said, "I don't understand. How can you make money with open source if it's free? I can understand how it's done. Can you tell me how somebody can make money with open source? Because obviously some people don't get it."
Well,
companies.
So it goes back to what I was saying. Anyways, first of all, there's a couple of different models, and we probably don't have time to go through all of them. But fundamentally, there's way too much software.
Absolutely.
And what you want to do is commoditize to the point of free the stuff that doesn't deliver any differentiating value.
Exactly.
So much of the software stack that we all have in every application is plumbing.
Yeah.
There's plumbing, like how do I get the bytes in and out? How do I store it in a database so I can get to it later? Security, how do I do login, authentication? How do I make sure it's encrypted end to end? Like there's all of this stuff.
It's all the same.
It's all the stuff. You have to have it. It's hygiene and your customers just expect it. They're not going to pay you a penny for it.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So what you want to do is first of all, faster time to market, get as much of that as you can.
Yeah.
In the spots where you're looking around and you're going, well, my particular industry has these specific plumbing requirements, right? So whether you're talking about banking or finance or insurance or whatever industry, regulated or non-regulated, whatever industry you're talking about, there's a bunch of plumbing which is specific to that industry that your customers expect, and you're not going to get a nickel for it, right? So that stuff, you can work with your direct competitors and build it in open source in a co-development environment. And then what you've done is you've shared the cost and lowered the risk of developing code, which is just hygiene anyways.
Exactly.
Right. And so what you're doing is then now you're liberating your developers to focus on the things that your customers actually care about.
The high value stuff that's going to make money versus the plumbing they're not going to pay for.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So,
and that would apply too. That would, like if you're talking about the hardware stuff or even the software side of things, that could apply for software specific type of technologies and hardware and whatever. It could apply across the whole milieu, right?
Yeah, we're seeing more and more open hardware. I mean...
what I meant, sorry, Mike, what I meant was the software embedded into, for example, a haul truck, there's that, but there's also multiple vendors working on similar sort of software solutions for the industry that all have a lot of core stuff that's identical.
Yeah.
So it can work on whatever the product.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, and I'm guessing there are players like this in the mining industry.
Yes.
But I've seen many, many different industries where there's one or two players that have got a dominant position in a chunk of the marketplace that if you really look at it, it's just plumbing.
Yeah.
And so typically the way that works in open source now is then some upstart comes along and basically implements the same kind of stack in open source. Because there's this notion in business of maybe core versus complementary.
Yeah,
so there's certain things that are core to my business. That's how I make my money.
Yeah.
And there's certain things which are complementary where if I go and solve that problem, it's going to pull my product.
Yeah.
Right. So what happens is what might be core to these people that are incumbent in focusing on, like sometimes it's like there's like an industry specific protocol.
Yeah.
And there's one or two companies that know how to do that, and you have to pay them money to get that stuff. Well, there's another company that just wants that protocol to happen for free. So they do it in open source and give it away.
Yeah.
And those companies get disrupted. Yeah. And that's how progress happens in the software industry.
Exactly. And hopefully in the hardware industry, Tesla versus everybody else.
Yeah. Well,
a little differently though. So just back to the whole idea, the journey with the or other industries. And I agree 100%. It just doesn't happen. It's not a switch. It never ends. Yeah. Because the industry changes, people change, et cetera. So just a little bit on the journey. Like I'm sure there's not barriers. There was challenges getting other industries to get into open source now to the spot where there's manifestos and this sort of thing.
Well, it's
so what? Kind of curious a little bit about that journey, and were there any pivotal things that were done to help along the way, or is it just takes time?
Well, first of all, it does just take time because what you're talking about fundamentally is. Digital transformation is actually about changing culture.
Oh, 100%.
And
transformation is people.
There is nothing harder than changing culture. Like
but we live it.
Yeah, the business, there's no business problem harder than changing your company's culture. Yeah. And the other thing that's really interesting is that there's digital transformation, in my experience, and this is non-scientific, but in my experience, has been threatens middle managers. I couldn't tell you how many times I've had great conversations with like the low end of the developer pool that says, self-organizing meritocracy projects where we just work together and we break down the organizational silos and we solve a problem. Love it. And you talk to the executives and you talk about this vision about digital transformation and co-development and in a faster pace of innovation. They get it. They love it. And you talk to the middle managers, it's like, I'm not in charge anymore.
the exact same things happening in mining. That's the problem in the mining. Typically, there's some really cool companies and people that it's not a challenge, but typically that it's very similar.
And so what happens is you need to have, ultimately, you're not going to be successful unless you have some executives that really buy in, that are willing to help drive the change. You also, let's face it, middle managers are important. They own the institutional memory of the organization, right? So it's really important that you don't lose them along the way.
Of course, yeah.
But you do have to change the culture, and you do have to change the way that you drive innovation.
Yeah.
And one of the biggest things is in digital transformation is breaking down organizational silos. And have you ever heard this phrase, inner source?
Oh, yeah.
And that's really what inner source is doing. Inner source is not open source, because the fruits of the labor happen inside the organization, never leaves inside the organization. What inner source does is it helps change your software development culture inside your organization. Right? So, and one of the things that really helps is break down organizational silos. And so what happens in really large companies is you could have a group in three different divisions that are working on effectively the same thing.
We had that conversation with somebody in the industry yesterday.
Right? So what you do is, ideally what you do is you develop that once, and it becomes a reusable asset inside an internal organizational repository where everybody inside the organization can share it, and even, contribute to it and make sure it fits their. It's basically like open source, but all the sharing happens inside the corporate firewall. So inner source, in my view, some people in open source don't like it, but in my view, it's actually very helpful. Not really as a road to open source, because we can talk a little bit why that's different, but it really helps affect the culture in a good way inside the organization, and sets the culture up for future agility, future innovation, and future engagement, right? If you're not willing to collaborate with employees of the same company, you're going to have a really time collaborating with employees of your direct competitors. Yeah. Right. So that's why inner source is, in my mind, is quite a useful tool.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the difference is it's a way to change your internal culture, but it's not really on the same road as open source per se, because open source as a business tool is there's a journey that goes in as an organization embracing open source. First you have to get permission to be able to use it.
Yep.
Then you have to be able to get permission to contribute back to it.
Yep.
And those two steps are always entirely driven by motivations of faster time to market, reduce costs, and mitigate risks.
And I remember when the first time we met many years ago, it was 15 to 20 years ago, there's a very large telecom company was going through exactly that.
Yep.
And you probably remember the CTO at the time, and the legal counsel, who's a huge advocate of open source and trying to get a telecom company to basically adopt it.
Yep.
I remember it was a journey for them. They did it, and then they got bought or whatever.
Yeah.
Went under.
Yeah.
But yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, but you can actually use open source as a market shaping tool in the limit.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, some great examples of that is Google open sourcing Android.
Yeah, yeah.
Sun Microsystems and later Oracle open sourcing Java. Right? So those are going past just reducing costs. Now you're using open source as a strategy to make money. And typically what you're doing is you're open sourcing a piece of technology which is actually complementary to your business.
Yep.
Right? Android is free because Google is in the ad business.
Yeah.
Right?
They weren't doing it out of the goodness of their hearts.
Yeah, there's
a business reason behind it.
There is a business reason behind this. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, and the other side too, just on the transformation of the industry culture, 100% agree. If you're going to do something different, you've got to get that top down, bottom up buy-in all the way across, right? Having the two ends isn't good enough. You've got to get all the way. If you can get the middle one, they can go up and down. That helps too. But also pressure from in the mining industry, for example. I'm going to make an analogy between the automotive industry and the mining industry. So the car manufacturers like the Mercedes-Benz, like you talked about, Volkswagen, et cetera, they weren't getting pressure from the buyers. It was like there was no pressure from the buyers that you've got to do this transformation. It's just more features than anything else. We want more versus you have to go open source and have interoperability and all this sort of stuff.
So I don't think anybody is. I don't think a typical purchaser of a Mercedes-Benz is going, Mercedes-Benz, you need to use open source. That's not. No, what they're saying is, features. I want autonomous driving. I want better electrification. I want a better experience in the cockpit. And you have to figure all of this out, and you have to do it in an economical way. And you need to support this for at least 15 years.
Exactly. So the differentiation, again, I'm using this analogy. So I think the differentiation and potentially opportunity for the mining industry is, for example, in mining, again, autonomous and all this sort of stuff is really important in the industry. You talked about electrification, that the whole industry is going through that, decarbonization, whatever. In the mining industry, what you have is that not 37. I don't know how many OEMs there are for vehicles or whatever. Interoperability between them is a bit of a challenge, right? In some cases, how do you get over that interoperability? So in the case of the market, what I think, and maybe I'm incorrect, is that if you get enough of the giants who buy this from the people you mentioned, the company, large OEM who's carved out a big niche, we're comfortable, we're okay. But what if the market basically said, look, you people have to get together and sort this out because we can't do this. You've got to be able to work a little better together, whatever it is. Common, as you said, common plumbing. I don't think they're doing it. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure they're not doing it. So in this case, I think, and I could be wrong, that the market can actually drive some of that as well, saying this is what we need you to do, boys, and it's primarily boys.
Yep.
Get with it.
Yeah, I think you're right. But I think there's some cases where there's going to have to be a few bumps along the road.
Oh, of course.
So let me give you one example.
It's not go.
Yeah. So like the App Store example.
Yeah.
Right. So what's part of the reason why, I'm an iPhone user. Why do I want Apple CarPlay in my car? Well, because I want the apps on my phone to show up on my dashboard and be integrated seamlessly.
Yeah.
Right.
Without plugging it, like I have Android, I got to plug it into the car.
Yeah.
What's the point?
Well, yeah, exactly. So there are cheaper versions of CarPlay that do that as well.
Yeah.
But actually, CarPlay is a really interesting example because there's consumer demand for this software feature.
Yeah.
And down the road, some of the OEMs have this vision that they're going to basically replicate that experience.
Yeah.
But there are billions of iPhones.
Yeah.
Or at least they sell hundreds of millions a year. Even a big car manufacturer sells 1 or 2 million.
Yeah.
So you're not how are you going to attract the developers to a market size which is 2 orders of magnitude smaller than the mobile market?
Yeah.
Right. So that's a
compelling argument.
It's a really tough problem.
Yeah.
But then CarPlay is an interesting example because there's actually right now in the automotive industry it's an example of potentially overreach.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Because so what Apple is telling the car manufacturers is if you want the next generation of CarPlay in your cars, you have to give Apple control of your instrument cluster. And as I understand the story, at least GM has already said absolutely not.
Oh God, no.
Yeah. So because I don't know so Apple invested billions of dollars in they were thinking about they were going to enter the automotive market. There was going to be an Apple car.
Yeah.
And just I think like 6 months ago or something like that, they said no. We basically flush that down the toilet. But it seems like now what they want is to have turned all the car manufacturers into building cars for Apple.
Yeah.
And there's for years, I drove a Porsche.
Yeah.
All right. When I get into a Porsche, I want a Porsche experience. When a Mercedes driver gets into a Mercedes, they want a Mercedes experience.
That's why you buy it.
I like the fact that it has CarPlay.
Yeah.
But I still want the Mercedes experience to be the Mercedes experience.
At the same time.
Yeah. And so, anyways, it's going to be interesting to see how the market dynamics play out between, this control, the interest in getting more and more control of the consumer experience in the car. From the people coming from the Silicon Valley side of the equation.
That's interesting. I never heard of that. Wow, that's really cool. Scary but cool. That's why I drive a Harley. There's nothing on it. It's all iron. So I don't worry about that stuff. I don't even hear music. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
No, I had a couple of. It's more of opinion than anything else, I think. So I'll just give you an example of something we've been toying with and a challenge the industry has. You hear about digital twins, right?
Yep.
I think it's overused. You hear about AI and all, like they're buzzwords, marketing words versus real value from my perspective.
Sure. Yeah.
So one of the, again, if you want to take a look at like a software defined mining company, for example, I'm going to use that term. I'm just going to use that term. It's easier. So for example, what the industry does now for mine planning, right? They do mine planning and they do this stuff and it's fixed in stone.
Literally.
Fixed in rock, fixed in dirt, whatever. It's fixed in stone. It's hard to change that, right? And it takes a lot of time and effort to do this. So this idea of digital twins, I'm going on a bit of a rant here, a bit of a segue here. So digital twins, basically what they're set up to do now is model and simulate. We've got this cup, make a digital version of it, and we'll simulate it.
Yep.
But at the end of the day, ideally at the end of the day, the utopian place to be is I want to build and operate a mine without spending a cent on capital. I'm not buying it. So basically you model and simulate the whole thing, all of it. Kind of like the aerospace when you're flying a plane, right? That's the analogy. You're flying a plane. Yeah, like the pilots are flying, and this is some of the work I did at Carleton with some of the profs there was the simulators where you're flying the plane many, many times, and there's all sorts of other components go into it before you build it, right?
Sure.
Okay, that sort of modeling simulation at the highest level. One of the challenges to do some of that, even with any layer of that, is the data and the connectivity and everything else. So for example, in the value chain of mining, you've got the people that do the drilling and the exploration. It's a set of data. They'll use 12 to 15 different vendors, software packages, whatever, that are disconnected. One company actually hired a gaming company to build middleware to integrate the data. That's on one piece of the value chain. And you've got the data is flipped over, reports are flipped over to the mine geologist, and then they generate data, and then it goes to mine planning, and then it goes, and then it goes. So all the data sets are discrete and disconnected, and there's discrete different software packages used to deal with this data, right? It's going to be hard to simulate an operation in the same idea as an airplane without at least connecting some of this data. And you can't apply AI because it's not real, because you don't have the data sets. People thinking it's not even close. When's the last time a ball mill passed a Turing test? Never, right? Most people don't even know what Turing test means. So there's that at the end of the day. To get that sort of thing started, and this is a discussion we've actually had with the industry, it's something called ore body knowledge. So you understand what the mineral is here, and then you create your waste product and your products there, is following that mineralogy end to end, which is data. Acquiring the data and following the data. So it's called ore body knowledge. So trying to do that with the way the industry works now, the way the suppliers work now, the way the software, the data works now, it's impossible. You can't do it. But what if you had, I love the term plumbing. What if you could create I call it plumbing, whatever. What if you could create that thing that is the plumbing, right? With the, ID, SDK, whatever you want to call it. So you can actually connect that data regardless of who the vendor is, regardless of where the data comes from.
So this is
maybe I'm off tangent.
No,
That's
you're
impossible.
like you're giving me a softball here, because we actually have a solution to that. It's called data spaces. So, and let me give you the automotive. Remember, I was talking about in the automotive industry. There's the in-car, there's the manufacturing, and there's the IT side.
Yeah.
On the IT side, there's the whole supply chain management thing.
Yep. Yeah.
So there is an initiative in Europe called Catena X.
I'm thinking Catena, which is Spanish.
Yeah. So CATENA-X.
Yeah.
And what that is doing is using a new type of technology called data spaces to do complete traceability of data across the entire automotive value chain.
Okay. So it's like a platform software solution that you can.
But let me explain what this concept of data space is.
Yeah.
So we're all familiar with databases.
Yeah.
Right? So what data spaces do is the way to you could have add data space, which under the hood is implemented as an SQL database.
Yeah.
But there is a set of APIs and a set of rules and a set of transactions that govern the use of that data.
Okay.
And that's what the data space defines. And by the way, this has all just been enshrined in European law under the EU Data Act. So this
really?
It's just the law just went past. So this is going to be legally enforced in Europe in 2 years.
Holy cow.
Is this concept of data spaces in terms of how you have to provide data interoperability.
That's the key word, is the operability of the data from wherever.
And what they're trying to do is change the market dynamics of the cloud.
Yeah.
And so right now, the hyperscalers are winning because they sit on top of enormous aggregates of data. And so Google and Facebook can monetize data in ways that most companies cannot.
So just to segue for a second, when you've used hyperscaler several times, that's like
Amazon, Microsoft, and Google.
Just to make sure.
Google Cloud. Yeah. So like the big three in particular that operate infrastructure as a service.
Yeah. Yeah.
So data spaces originally came out from a way to let's figure out a way to federate data.
Yes. Yeah.
Rather than reward the pooling of data.
Yeah.
And
sorry, Mike, again, as you're talking, I'm trying to understand this. So data spaces, what's the difference? Is data pooling like a data lake?
So yes, you can build data lakes from data spaces.
Okay, got it.
So data spaces are a technology that allows you to federate or aggregate data.
Yeah.
And each data space would be owned and controlled by one entity.
Yep.
It's going to give you a definition of what data is there.
Yep.
But more importantly, we've been able to do that kind of simple data aggregation for years. But more importantly, what it's going to do is it's going to give you rules on who's allowed to use the data.
Yeah.
And it'll tell you what you have to pay for the data.
Yeah.
So in the limit, data spaces are going to enable a whole new class of business models that we've never been able to have before because we've never been able to have, it's basically like a machine economy for data.
So in this data space, is that something that the Eclipse Foundation actually built as one of its projects?
So this, again, back to what I said earlier about digital sovereignty. So data spaces is one of the initiatives. It's largely driven by an organization called the International Data Space Association.
Okay.
But the open source implementations, so they're developing the standards, they're developing the best practices, the roadmaps, the blueprints, all that kind of stuff. When it actually comes down to working code, yes, you want to go and see the Eclipse data space component.
Okay, got it.
That is
connectivity between the standard stuff and the code.
And there's things in there like there's a data space protocol, there's a trust protocol, there's an identity protocol. So basically a set of protocols that allow you to access data in this new and interesting way.
So and again, just so I understand this, I think I understand it, which would be pretty scary for me. but in the analogy I had, if you had say a mining company X, right? Has data from software packages from these 12 vendors here, these 13
and they
here.
Own the data.
And in most cases, they own it. In some cases, the vehicles, there's a vehicle data ownership issue. But for the stuff on site, they own it.
Yep.
The data space solution could actually consolidate, be used to bring all this stuff together.
And so this is looping back to what I said, and that's kind of what Katina X is doing for the automotive value chain. So Katina X is taking this notion of data spaces and making it operational for the automotive supply chain.
Yeah.
Right. So imagine a world where your exploration company, the guys that are out there diamond drilling, and they've got a whole bunch of assay data and all that. They have a data space that defines the kind of data, and they can authorize its use by certain trusted parties for X amount of money.
Yeah, external consultants, whoever it is,
right?
Absolutely.
And then that becomes like one node in the value chain.
Yeah.
Then you've got the geologists that are actually out there trying to figure out exactly where the ore body is and where we're going to build the mine, and then there's the how we're going to actually refine it and what we're going to produce, where we're going to put the waste. All of this stuff is generating data.
Yeah.
And right now you don't have a technology that allows you to seamlessly federate that data in a cohesive way so that everybody in the value chain can make use of it. Right? Basically, everything in the value chain becomes a pairwise transaction between a single node in the value chain and the company on either side of it that's looking to either put data in or get data out. Yeah. Right. And that's from a software perspective, you can't possibly do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So it's never going to work.
Yeah.
Right. So what data spaces are giving you is a new type of technology that's going to allow you to define the data. And again, we've had the data aggregation problem becomes it's using common APIs and protocols across the entire value chain.
Yeah.
So everybody however their data is managed inside is completely proprietary, and whatever they're doing, they're doing. But now they can publish it in a way so that they can authorize its use and monetize it in a cohesive manner that everybody else in the value chain can do it, and then the transactions become automated.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. So
this is really. I think somebody had mentioned data spaces to me before. I have to go back and look up the notes, but yeah, it sounds really that this could be something the industry could use on this idea of the data connectivity and just as a practical example, say you have the mining company X, they've got the data space set up, the data is federated from multiple different places. There's whatever software model, this is outside the software model to do the analysis, simulation, modeling, whatever you want to call it, whatever you want to call that thing, with all these different sources of data. The data space would basically be the place where the data would be housed, so you could actually do that sort of integrative sort of analysis, modeling, AI, whatever you call it.
And back to what the original vision that you were talking about being able to basically model a mine before you even build it. So I don't buy that for a second. That's not going to work. And here's why: is you don't have the data. Right. So what you need to do is we basically need to go through a generation, like a technology generation, where the digital twins are accumulating the data.
Yeah, agreed.
You can't build
and then put them together.
Right. You can't build a simulation if you don't have the data, because you're just guessing.
Yeah.
Right. But right now, there's no way for companies to aggregate and monetize their telemetry data.
Exactly.
So right now, what's usually happening is they're actually getting a lot of telemetry data, and they're just kind of chucking it because they don't know what to do with it.
Yeah.
Right. So this is a way to actually start collecting. If you collect it, you can actually do something with it down the road.
Exactly. And I would disagree with what you just said, that you can't do it. But you said by your follow-up sentence, yes, you can, but you've got to have the digital twins or whatever to collect the data first. The challenge is, the first thing is connectivity of the information and the data from digital twins, so you can actually look at the entire operation.
Right.
Then you can do the next piece.
Yeah.
Potentially.
So right now, if you are a mine that's been in operation for X number of years, and you wanted to go back and see the data that drove a decision N number of years ago that came from your exploration company, how would you do that?
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. But like you said, it's feasible, but here are the steps to try and get there. And the first one is you need the data to try and do that. But you need to collect the data first, plus whatever you've had.
That's what I said. Like you need basically you need like a generation of data accumulation, and aggregation, and analysis before you have the data to drive the simulation.
Yeah, when I'm a strategy guy, I like to look at the endpoint, not the steps to get there. Let somebody else
well, I'm an
do
engineering guy, so I always want to figure out how you're actually going to get it to work.
Put the two together, and we're there. So when you spoke at our session a couple of years ago, I think you gave, I'm not sure, I could be wrong, I think you gave a couple of examples of whether it's specific Eclipse projects or whatever. I talked to one of the guys that used to be at Eclipse, Mark Vlorman, years ago about a potential project. Says, we can do that. So there's a couple of things Eclipse can do. I'm questioning when number one is, any examples of what you see potentially where Eclipse or even open source in general could be used in mining? We've talked about a couple of them. But the other one, too, is that if the mining industry or a select subset of the mining industry wanted to get together, because they see the value and they need some way to collaborate to do this co-developed software, could Eclipse do that? Could Eclipse be the organization that hosts it versus somebody like us trying to host it, which we've never done? Because you've got the governance rules and everything else in place.
Yeah, so if you actually want...
there's two questions there.
Yeah, so first of all, yes, absolutely, we can host stuff like that. Yeah. So, I mean, we've hosted, we call them industry collaborations in all kinds of different industries. Yeah. And I know every industry loves to believe that they're completely unique and so on, but the problems always end up being the same. And so yes, we could definitely host something like that. And I think... but some kind of examples. So there's probably a bunch from our IoT and edge technologies. Yeah. So not a perfect example, but for example, there's a whole bunch of pipelines in Canada and across around the world. The pipelines are being managed using MQTT. And so basically what MQTT is a lightweight transport layer for telemetry data.
Okay.
right? So there's on a pipeline, there's a whole bunch of different sensors along the way. There's the pumping stations, and basically every one of these things along the way, you want to be constantly in real time accumulating the data and the telemetry data.
MQTT is something that came out of Eclipse.
Yeah, well, yes. So we have the leading open source implementation of protocol
MQTT.
Of MQTT. Now, building on top of MQTT, there's a technology called Sparkplug, which is a technology.
We're back to automotive again.
I don't name these things. It was not my name. But what it does is it provides machine interoperability. So right now, so imagine, so if you had machines, you're putting together some kind of refinery, right?
Yeah.
So you got a bunch of machines that are crushing ore, a bunch of machines that are doing this, doing that. Imagine a scenario where you had machines from 5 different manufacturers.
Geez, I'd never hear about that in mining.
And machines from 5 different manufacturers, but you only have one control room.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, so now what you want to do is you want to have real-time SCADA information for all the stuff that's happening in your mill on one console.
Yeah.
Right? With Sparkplug, you can actually, if all 5 manufacturers are implementing Sparkplug, the machines will just start talking to each other and delivering data in the same format out of the box.
So Sparkplug is a protocol software. There's both.
Think of it. So it builds on top of MQTT. So MQTT
got it.
is. So think of it like HTTP versus HTML. Like, If you're a technology. So HTTP is the protocol that says your browser talks to the server, but HTML defines the content.
Exactly.
So MQTT is the protocol, and Sparkplug is the content.
The content. Yeah. Got it. That's a brilliant analogy because I actually understand it.
The example I used in the talk some years ago was there was like a ceiling bolt that actually
a bolt and rock bolt.
Rock bolt had sensors in it, and it was using a protocol called CoAP, and it was sending telemetry data.
Yeah.
So you could actually tell ahead of time. You could tell what the stress was on that bolt.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And that's an example of a protocol implementation. And that was actually using software directly from the Eclipse Foundation inside the bolt.
So it's funny. We talk to mining companies. We're not, or suppliers. We don't use open source software.
They're lying.
Yeah. They're probably using it in some cases and they don't even know it.
Well,
it's like Apache, right? Web servers are all primarily Apache, but nobody knows.
I can guarantee you, whatever car you're driving, and including your Harley Davidson, there's software in that somewhere.
There's no software. It's wrenches and nuts and bolts.
I'm pretty sure there's software. There might be software in the
ECM, the electronic control
in the
module.
ECUs. There's definitely software in the ECUs. If there's software in anything, there's
open source somewhere in it.
There's almost certainly open source in there somewhere. There's like some really small examples, like deeply embedded stuff that's not true. But generally speaking, like there's like your in-home Wi-Fi camera.
Yeah.
Like 90% of the software that's in that camera is open source.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Your television.
Yeah.
If you look in your manual that you got with your television, I can almost guarantee you there's a copy of the GNU public license in the manual.
Well, right? I boot up the TV, not that I watch it anymore, and it's Android based.
Of course, right. which is open source.
Exactly.
Right? So,
and the direct uploads and downloads and App Store and everything else. Yeah.
Let me roll back and tell the story a different way. So a lot of people, I totally understand and agree that they think of open source as something that first it's not serious or what. Like, let me explain it this way: the modern world wouldn't exist without open source.
Yeah.
So if you think about like how much of our lives are determined by what we typically call the web or the internet.
Yeah.
What most non-technical people don't understand is the internet and the web are actually 2 different things.
Yeah.
Right. And it was absolutely an accident of history that those 2 technologies became open. So the internet was funded by the U.S. Defense Department to create a protocol that would survive a nuclear war.
That was the ARPA program at the time.
That was
ARPANET.
So imagine that. The design point was design a network infrastructure that will survive a nuclear war.
Yeah.
That was
this node dies, the network keeps going. That sort of thing.
As long as there's one DNS server somewhere,
you're good.
You can.
I remember seeing those diagrams.
Yeah. So that's the founding of the internet, and that gentleman's name is Vint Cerf.
Yeah.
Right. And then the founding of what we call the World Wide Web, most people short to the web, is HTML and HTTP.
Yeah.
And that was done by Tim Berners-Lee
Yeah.
at the European Center for Nuclear Research, CERN. And they had a strict policy that every single thing that they did had to go public domain because it's nuclear research in Europe, and they didn't. And that was part of the policy. So the U.S. Defense Department put out TCP/IP as an open protocol because they wanted all the universities to start using it.
Yeah.
And the World Wide Web from Europe came because it was part of the nuclear research. If those things hadn't been free, we would still be using CompuServe and AOL.
Yeah.
And like the whole history of how we all, like the environment that we live in.
A lot of it's serendipitous.
It's serendipitous, but the point is that it's woven into the fabric of our daily lives.
Yes.
If you don't believe that open source doesn't affect your life, you just don't understand how it actually how your world actually works.
Yeah.
Right? And similarly, it goes to the importance of open source in the fact that free is a really good price if you want technology to be widely adopted.
Yeah.
The fact that anybody can modify it, change it, distribute it, use it, study it, that spurs innovation in new and interesting ways that you couldn't possibly predict when you first invented it.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny. I remember, Mike, when you first started talking about, software has eaten the world. 100%. You just have to think about it for a second. Sit back and think about it, right? And it actually has I guess the question I have is not for you, but it's more for the mining industry. Digitalization, digital transformation. Everybody's talking about it. I'm not sure people really, really understand what the endpoint is and where the things that could be done and how. But what I would like to see is software eat the mining industry more than it's eating now. So they're probably just taking a slice of the pie. And like it's the stuff you talked about, autonomous interoperability, data space, all that stuff directly related to what the mining industry is trying to accomplish now. Again, I'm not personally really connected to the OEMs about what they're doing, but I think there's opportunities.
Oh yeah. So I know
for sure, like the
software,
automotive stack and software-defined vehicles, guaranteed that stuff is relevant to mining.
Well, I mean, do you have any mining equipment with Cummins diesels in them?
Maybe.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so Cummins is part of the software-defined vehicle, and there's a whole bunch of heavy equipment manufacturers that we've been talking to.
Yeah.
Because the challenges in the heavy equipment space are not that different than the challenges in the automotive space.
Well, they're the same.
Well,
they're very. There's so many. Well, as I said before, we borrowed your operating model and operating membership model and your business model. We borrowed it to do not the same thing, but apply it. It works. There's obviously connectivity there.
A lot of the technology platforms that we're building are directly applicable to what they need to do.
Yeah.
Like even like the stuff that I was talking about around like the MQTT telemetry data, as I understand it, there is MQTT inside most of the heavy equipment that's running around your mines today.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Right. So it's
it's the next level of the interoperability between equipment. So you can actually have mixed fleets and all this sort of stuff. Because right now and there's a data ownership issue. Because I remember you and I talked maybe 5-6 years ago about DRM, digital rights management, and like ownership of data, how you do that. There's a problem that has to be solved in that space, I think, in the industry, from what I've heard.
It's kind of interesting that in some of that stuff is actually, I think, going to be regulated in Europe first.
Yeah.
So there's, I believe, within the next year or two, there's going to be like digital right to repair acts coming in Europe.
Yeah. Well, they're talking about that on the hardware side with Apple and the right to repair and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah, but a lot of right to. The first time I really heard the phrase right to repair, it was farmers complaining about John Deere.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Oh yeah. Because like nowadays, it used to be when you bought a tractor, if something was broken, you could fix it yourself.
Yeah.
And now so much of the tractor is software, and you don't get you bought the tractor, but you don't own the software
or the data that is probably shipped back to John Deere.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
and that's the same issue in the mining industry, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. So one of the pockets of interest in what we're doing in software-defined vehicle, it hasn't materialized in members yet, but we've talked to a bunch of companies. Is actually insurance companies.
Okay.
Because what insurance companies really want to do is have access to the telemetry data for your car, and they can basically base your insurance on how fast you drive.
It's kind of like Apple wanting to control the instrument cluster so they can get data back.
But I know for a fact that there is already at least one insurance company in Germany that I know of where if you buy a certain policy, you get a dongle and you put it in your OBD port.
Yeah.
And it's sending data to the insurance company. And you're basically, when you sign the policy, you're committing that you're going to drive within certain parameters of safety. And
they'll monitor and then say sorry, and then they'll want the right to shut down the car.
They're going to say, sorry, bud, but here's your new bill.
Your premium went up, and if you take a look at the business model for that, every time they go over, they get a bill for going over, or just monthly increment or whatever.
Yeah,
there's all sorts of ways they can penalize this.
But actually, so one of the in the limit ideas around this data space is, imagine if your own personal data, instead of being surrendered for free to Google, et cetera, and Apple, and is basically, you actually had your data was sovereign.
Yeah.
And you had your own data space, and you could decide who got access to that data.
Absolutely.
And what they had to pay you for.
Exactly. Monetize it.
Yeah. So
and even discrete pieces of that data.
Yeah. Imagine what a change that would be to Facebook's business model.
I use MySpace. I'm kidding. I think we're getting pretty close to 2 hours now. This has been fun. My God, we could probably keep going. So, Mike, is there anything else? Any other thoughts about open source mining, the state of the world with open source? You've mentioned most of it already. Any other closing ideas?
Well, anybody who's actually listened to this long, thank you for staying with us.
well, what we're going to do is we're going to take little snippets out and push them out on specific pieces, and the whole podcast will be out there.
So. Okay, so look, I come from a nonprofit world. I've been running a nonprofit organization for 20 years.
Yeah.
But my key message is open source is a fundamentally better way to do business.
Yes.
This is not, altruism is not a business model.
Yeah.
Right? So don't mistake nonprofit with altruism.
Yeah.
And so now there's lots of open source which is driven by altruism, and that's great. But what open source does is it enables a set of software-driven business models that would be impossible without it.
Yeah.
And so as you think about your digital transformation journey as a company, keep in mind that what that really means is you have to become a software-centric organization.
Yep.
And if you look at every software company on the planet, they're all using open source.
Yep.
Even Microsoft is now deeply, deeply invested in open source.
They used to have Lab 25.
Yeah, right? Well, now they own GitHub.
Yeah,
and
there you go. Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. No, Microsoft bought GitHub. So they're deeply, deeply invested in open source. And the thing to keep in mind is, if digital transformation means I have to change my business to become a software-driven business, what I'm telling you is you cannot claim victory on that journey if you have not figured out how to use open source as an integral part of your software production process.
Strategically and tactically.
Exactly.
Right. Absolutely. This has been awesome. Mike, this has been a great conversation. Absolutely fantastic. Thank you for taking the time. I know you're super busy running 4 companies, and I'm going to keep my eye on the industry and see where it's going. See if we can push this open source sort of thing a little better, because there's a lot of what you said is directly related to the mining industry. Directly. Let's see if we can get it going a little further. Thank you for tuning into Source. We hope you'll learn some valuable insights and really cool information about the mining industry, and especially how it impacts our lives every single day. You want to stay tuned to what we're up to and the really cool innovations that are going on every single day? Connect with us on our social media channels, LinkedIn, Twitter, or at our website, rethinkmining.org. Until next time, catch you later.